Should know about that stuff.
Okay, now it is. Testing. Good afternoon.
Give it 1 second.
Let's try. Oh, now it's working. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this event that we've worked to pull off a couple times, and we're so lucky to finally be able to do it today. My name is Libby Smith, and my husband Dennis and I came to Christ Church in about 1998. And shortly after that, we started the work to build the sanctuary. And when the sanctuary was finally finished, we were within a year of being at our centennial. So it was really interesting at that time. Here we were stepping into the future, but we were learning so much about our history. And at that time, I did a series of articles on the 10 families that had been here at Christ Church the longest. And that's what helped me meet Ed and Peggy and 8 other wonderful people, some of you who are probably here today. And it just woke me up. It opened my eyes to the fact of how this little agricultural little community was just skyrocketing in its growth.
I'll get it.
How important it was that we learned about our roots as well as our wings. So today, Ed, who is, just loves history. This is a passion of his, and he's spent a lot of time researching and sharing things with us. He's going to share those with us. And along with him today is his cousin, Peggy Terrio. So Peggy and Ed grew up right in this neighborhood. Ed's great-grandmother lived in this house on the corner where Kathy Mordeau lives now. The house that Father Brian and Sherry live in, Ed grew up in that house. So it's some really great history. So I'd like you today to welcome Ed and Peggy, and there's going to be time for all of you to share in your memories. We're going to go for about an hour and take a break. If you need to get up, take care of things, whatever, great. But if you could wait on refreshments and refilling your plates and stuff till the break, that would be wonderful. We're recording this, and it is also on Zoom. Is that right? So people are watching right now too. So thank you all for coming today, and now I'll turn the program over to Ed Heyer.
Well, thank you. I want to make it clear I'm not a historian. I'm just old and been here a long time. So as Libby mentioned, I grew up in the house where Father Brian lives now. Went
You
to
left
church.
a few things.
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
Spirits in there. No.
Oh, I thought you meant my comic books. And I went to church here, of course, and then grade school across the street. And then my grandmother lived across the street here. And then for a while, my other grandmother lived in the cottage next to our house. So this is kind of home base for me. Anyway, a lot of the old founding members here and the old members were pioneer families. So I'll just talk about our family a little bit as an example. So when my grandfather died, Grandpa Bean, Peg and I are descended from.
Can I get you to hold that a little closer so my dad could hear?
Is that better? Yeah.
Is that a little better?
Maybe just point it at you a little bit more.
Okay.
If you'll do like that.
That.
Yes.
Okay. So, anyway, when Peg and I are first cousins, as Libby mentioned, so her father and my mother were brother and sister. So we're derived from the Bean and Sobey family. So when our Grandpa Bean passed away, Grandma Bean came to live with us in that cottage, and she and my mom were good, faithful members here for a lot of years as well. But Grandma Bean came from an old pioneer family. Her grandmother, or great-grandmother, came here in 1861 to Denver during the gold strike. And then she later homesteaded out there west of Sedalia. And our great-grandmother came by stagecoach in about 1868, I think it was. And she homesteaded by Sedalia as well, along with one of her other brothers. Anyway, at that time, 1861, Colorado had just become a territory. Prior to that, it was part of the Kansas territory in this part of the state. And that's the birth of Douglas County. See, Douglas County is one of the original 17, and it went all the way to the Kansas state line. And you'll see the county seat was in we call it Franktown now. It's called Frankstown at that time. So, and then our grandfather Bean, we trace his heritage back to a person that came to the United States, or America, I should say, in 1654. And he was an indentured servant.
Yeah.
So he didn't come necessarily voluntarily, but they migrated to Maine. And then later on, our grandfather had 3 uncles that came out here in 1871, supposedly on the first train to Denver, is the story.
Mhm.
So they farmed, and eventually our great-grandfather joined them. So. Now, on my father's side, I go back to one of the founders of the church, and her name was Caroline Curtis Ball. And she came with her father in 1871. Her father was Henry Curtis, who homesteaded over on the Perry Park Road. And one of our other cousins, Natalie, is here, Natalie Young. So Natalie's mother was Peg, my first cousin as well. Then on my father's side, I'm related to her grandfather, so she's a double cousin to me.
County.
Yeah. It gets a little weird.
Family tree's a little hairy.
Yeah.
Twisted.
So anyway, when they came from Wales, they homesteaded on a ranch over there on the Perry Park Road. She was about 11 when she came. And it's interesting, we have the old Curtis family history book. So we have copies of letters that her father wrote home. And it's interesting to me, they came by train from New York after they'd come across the ocean from Wales. It took 5 days, and it cost $79 per adult, which surprised me. It's that expensive to come all the way out here. And then population of Douglas County at that time was about 1,390 people. He writes also in the family history book that he added to his homestead, he bought 240 acres for $1,500. That's not $1,500 an acre, that's the whole thing. Another 160 acres for $600. So they did have some interaction with the Indians. There was a time my great-grandmother told the story to my father that she was alone with her mother there, and all the men were out working in the fields, and a band of Indians rode towards the house. And in those days, you just didn't know for sure. The main Indian wars were in the 1860s, but even in 71, there was some unrest, and you just weren't real confident of who might be coming. So when she saw him coming, she hid my great-grandmother in a closet there while she took food out and fed all the Indians until they were full, then they left. But they caused no harm. And then it's in the family stories, Chief Uray, who you probably know as the Ute Indian chief, he camped on the ranch a couple of times. And then my great-great-grandfather, Henry Curtis, helped build St. Philip's Church. So that was in 1871. So they originally just built the interior of that, and it was finished sometime later. And at that time, and for quite a few years after that, it was served by Methodist circuit riders. And there was a story once, there was an imposter. Supposedly a congregation has saved up $600, and when the pot got so big, he took off with that. So, so I have to keep our eye on Father Brian.
We'll have a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got more than 600 set up.
Yeah. Just keep your eye on that coffee fund over there.
And then we'll be all right.
Yeah. Then it became an Episcopal church in 1888. But since that time, we've shared priests a lot over the years. One of the first priests I heard was Reverend Russell, and he was there. And I believe Father Picken and Father White and Father Rufy and Father Rick, I remember. Yeah.
Man, winners.
Yeah. So
Father Brian.
anyway, at one point they've pretty much got their own priest there. But we still have a close relationship with them. So. And then around the church is Bear Canyon Cemetery. Looks a little different now. If you go over today, you see it covered with trees. It looks pretty barren in this picture. But that's a separate entity. It's open to all. You don't have to be an Episcopalian to be buried there, or even a Christian for that matter. one old tombstone, I'm not sure where it is, but there is a head marker there with the person's name and the dates of his life. There's an engraving of a hand with a finger pointing to the sky. And Grandma Bean used to say it always should be pointing down. But we're good Episcopalians, so we don't judge. But it's a spiritual place for me. I have a set of great-great-grandparents. I have 2 great-grandmothers, a great-grandfather, both sets of grandparents, my parents, aunts and uncles. We probably have 100 cousins buried there.
Yeah,
So.
over there.
So you recognize this picture, you've seen it before, I'm sure. So when my great-grandmother, Caroline Curtis Ball, was older, she married a man named Frank Ball. And he had come here with his father. His father, Daniel, had been in the Civil War. And he was from Massachusetts, but he got captured by the Confederates and sent to Andersonville Prison. And if you've ever read about Andersonville Prison, it was unbelievably horrible conditions. It was built for something like 3,000 men. There ended up being like 9,000 in there. There was no housing. They had to dig foxholes, just cover them with boards or tarp, whatever. And there was a creek that ran through the place that served both as the water supply and the sewer. So he survived that, but he had TB. And in the late 1800s, Colorado was known as a health state. A lot of people would come here for the sunshine and dry air. If you remember Doc Holliday, the old gunfighter, he came to Glenwood Springs and stayed in a sanitarium up there, actually died up there at Glenwood Springs. So my grandfather came with him, and my great-grandfather, Daniel, he did feel better when he got here, but he felt so good he went back to Massachusetts. He caught cold, got pneumonia, and died. But Frank stayed, and at that time he was like 19 or 20, but he had 2 years at Amherst College. So that practically made you a professor in those days. It was a lot of education. So he became a teacher, and later on became the superintendent of county schools. So my great-grandmother and father moved in that house where Kathy lives, and I think about 1894.
Strawberries had a nice touch.
Then they lived there to my great-grandmother's death. So the church there, that was shortly after it was built. That was built in 1906. And at that time, this was truly the end of town. There was nothing to the east except cattle pasture. The old grade school across the street was here at that time, but that was about it. And the church, you probably have heard, it was originally organized as St. Peter's Church in 1905. And they met down over an old store down on 3rd and Wilcox Street. And they gradually put enough money together and the land was donated. And they built this church here. So my grandmother, Flora Ball, was more or less raised in that house. And when she met my grandfather, Robert Heyer, they were the first couple married in the church. That was 1908. And then my parents were married there, and Sue and I, so we got a little track record here. So. And then, whoops.
Is it on the screen? Or you just have to move here?
Oh.
So you just pooped down on me, didn't it? There we go. So, anyway, my grandparents then lived on farms most of their life, but then when my grandfather died at kind of an early age, my grandma Heyer moved back in this house with her mother, and she lived there until 1963, till she died. So we have about 70 years, I think, in the house. I don't know if Kathy can feel our spirit over there. So it was interesting. I have my great-grandmother's diaries from about 1933 to 1948. And they're fascinating to read. It's like it goes through our daily lives. It's like opening a door and walking right back into it. And of course, that was the lead up to World War II. So she talks a lot about that. And she had a lot of foresight. She realized we'd be in the war eventually, so she talked a lot about it. And she just slowly went blind. And when I read the early diaries, it's very legible, nice writing. And then as she got older, she went totally blind at the end of her life. So this is the church after 1911. So Castle Rock would have been about 365 at that time, and Douglas County about 3,200. So this is when the sanctuary was built, and then a new entrance there. The old entrance, I don't know if you noticed on the earlier picture, but the old entrance was right here, and then they put a new entrance. But there's still no restrooms, no heating, no electricity, so it's still pretty bare bones. And then we'll talk more later about the growth of the church, but about 1954, when this guild hall here was added with the kitchen, the narthex, and the restrooms. And in 1965, the education wing was built. So when the church was started, people still got around pretty much like this. This was a lot of horse and buggies at that time. So this is a picture of my grandfather. It's either my dad or my uncle, but that was a farm they had over by Sedalia. So he was on the way to the creamery down in Sedalia. But it's just a much simpler life when you look at that. It was, I think it was about 1914 roughly. And, you know, it was just very simple. People grew their own food mostly. We didn't have to worry about car insurance or wait for the cable guy. So the downside was there was no central heat, no medicine, and if you had a bad tooth, they just pulled it. And the sad thing, almost every family lost a child. The child mortality rate was extremely high back then. But people back then, I think, also had a lot of time to ponder. I think probably when he got up to the end of the driveway and turned towards Sedalia, towards the city, we're going to the creamery. It was kind of autopilot after that. So it was a good hour and a half trip probably down to the creamery. So he had that time to spend with his son, and no radio, no outside interference, just relaxed in the countryside. So that was on the cusp of the automobile age. So I think this is my grandfather's first car. And if it's correct, I found an old obituary. The first cars in Douglas County were in 1910. There's two of them, one for Dr. Alexander, one for Dr. Palmer. So statewide, in 1900, there were 90, and in 1910, statewide, there was 4,680, but only two out here in Douglas County. It'd be interesting to know if they got together and raced. You'd be guaranteed second, I guess. And by 1920, there was 129,000 cars. As of 2020, there was 5,350,000 cars. So the world has gotten a lot noisier, a lot faster. So back in the early days, most of the schools were one-room schoolhouses. This was a schoolhouse at the intersection of Wolfensberger and Perry Park Road. Well, this picture was taken, it had been abandoned for a lot of years, but some years back, the county lifted up and hauled it over to South Street Elementary. I don't know if it's still there, but it's kind of a museum piece.
Yeah.
But that's the school my dad went to for 8 years, and his siblings. As I mentioned, my great-grandfather Ball was the superintendent of schools, so he had to visit every one of these in a horse and buggy. So, yeah. And then my dad, it doesn't show here, but there was a shed there off to the left. So kids would mostly ride their horses to school. And then one kid was assigned to come early, and he would start the potbelly stove and warm it up for him. But obviously no restrooms, cafeteria, anything like that. But it's interesting to me that, you know, they all did well. Gosh, my dad was a pretty successful businessman. My uncle graduated magna cum laude from CU Boulder, and my aunt graduated from high school at 15, CU Boulder at 19, and was teaching school by the time she was 20. So I guess they got a good start there. So the school across the street was grade 1 through 8, but it also offered a few high school classes where a lot of the kids in these schools, the 8th grade, and that was pretty much it, unless they could go board somewhere or go somewhere and go to school at the same time. But my grandfather, or great-grandfather Ball, I worked with a state representative here named Cole Briscoe. And he was an answer. I don't know if you knew Vicky Briscoe, Charles Briscoe. He went to church here for years. So Cole was one of his, like his grandfather. So they put together what was known as the high school bill. And that passed the state legislature. And that enabled each county to levy a tax to build a county high school. So after that, this is the Capital School across the street. So that was actually built in, the original structure there was 1875. It was a wooden structure. And then that burnt down in 1896. So this one was the rhyolite stone structure. It was built in 1897. So that's the one I mentioned. It did serve as a high school for the local district, not for the county. And after the high school bill was passed, this is the old high school built down on Wilcox Street. And again, there was a timber structure there prior to that, but it burnt down too. So there was some kid going around burning the school down. And it's been added on to it. It's now the administration building that you see down there on Wilcox Street. And Peggy went to school there.
Yeah, I graduated from that.
My brother did, and I would have, but they finished the new high school out in the frontage over there for my freshman year. So, yeah. So these are a couple of pictures of early Castle Rock. The top one was approximately 1889. So the town was actually formed in 1874, and it became the county seat at that point. It was after Elbert County was carved out of Douglas County. They wanted a site that was a little more central, so Castle Rock won the voting and became the county seat. Then it was incorporated in 1881. And then they finally got electricity in 1921.
174.
Most people still did not have refrigeration at that time. So my dad has told a story. His first job off the farm was an ice man. So most people had ice boxes. So he'd haul these blocks of ice around and drop them off. And then eventually refrigeration became more affordable. And the old ice boxes went away. But when I was growing up, I still called it an ice box. We just don't use the term at that. So. And the lower one is about 1950. And at that time, Highway 85 came straight through town. There wasn't an I-25. So I just looked up the current volumes on I-25. South of Wolfensberger, there's 98,000 vehicles per day. And up north of the Meadows, there's 130,000 vehicles per day. So it'd be fun to see them all coming through Castle Rock.
Well, that was
85. Yeah. So I just threw this in here. This is the old Castle Rock Fire Department. This was 1940, I think is when it was. So anyway, it won't mean this to you, but Peg and I, we know a lot of these old guys. So my father was up here. And then Doug Andrews, you know, the Andrews Caldwell Funeral Home. Doug Andrews is the one that started that. And then Jake Kroll, we used to have kind of neighborhood grocery stores in those days. So Jake Kroll had a grocery store, and there was one other. You would just call up, give me your order, and then a pickup truck with a high school kid would show up with your groceries. And he'd just run a tab to the end of the month. You just paid him whenever you got around to it. And then Shorty Howe was the town barber. And I don't know if you guys used to watch Mayberry with Andy Griffith, Floyd the barber. Shorty didn't look like Floyd, but the barber shop was a lot like that. People just go hang out there. So if you wanted any of the latest gossip, you just would drop in for a while. And you've seen old ladies gossip, but you haven't seen old men gossip. I remember if I come home with a good story, my folks would send me back down about 2 weeks for another haircut. So, had short hair. Then when it blew over, my hair would grow out again. So. Then my father told me that I don't know if it was this truck or not, but it was all volunteer. And there was one guy, I don't remember who he was, I'll just call him Mr. Jones. But he loved to ring the bell. So whenever there was a fire, he'd jump up in the front seat and start ringing the bell. So one day there was a call to help by a fire down by Larkspur. So they all got down there, and Mr. Jones started ringing the bell, heading out of town. but the truck had a governor on it. It would only go about 35 miles an hour. So why you put a governor on a fire truck, I have no idea. So anyway, they got on Highway 85 was before I-25 was there. And that wasn't long, there was a string of cars behind them. They'd start passing, then the trucks would start passing. But Mr. Jones just kept ringing the bell. By the time they got to the fire, it was all over. So. No, I just thought I'd list David Letterman had his top 10. So this is the top 10 snowstorms we had. So the big one was 1913, 45.5 inches of snow.
Oh.
So that's my grandfather on the top. He lived over west of Sedalia at that time. And then below is the trolley cars in Denver trying to move around. And it wasn't easy to move snow back in those days. There was no blades or tractors. So
You walked.
And then in 1946, it's kind of important to me. My best friend is a guy named Jerry Amen. He was born right before that storm, and I was born right after it. So I was telling him I was wise enough to stay right where I was till the storm. And then we had a cousin named Ava Sobey, and she was in Denver, and she was a widow. So she rode the train back from Denver to the station over the Santa Fe station across to the west. And she was quite anxious to get to her kids, but she decided to head for home during that storm. And the station master tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen, and she got disoriented and lost, and she froze. So she died of that. And then it's interesting too to notice that four of the top 10 are the 1980s. And I don't know why, but it's interesting. So I plotted the population, and I was aware of the numbers, but it didn't strike me till I plotted it. But if you look back here, my great-great-grandparents' time, and then my great-grandparents, my grandparents, my parents, and then the beginning of my life, it was pretty flat. And then the bomb went off, and it just went from there. So I know we noticed that here, but actually it's worldwide. I was looking at some world populations, and we had 2 billion in 1927, 3 billion in 1959, and now we've surpassed 8 billion. And what's striking to me, I was born in 1946, so the world population was about 2.5 billion at that point. And I think most anthropologists think it took early man came out of Africa about 250,000 years ago. So it took 250,000 years to my lifetime to get to 2.5 billion. And then in my lifetime, it's gone to 8 billion. So it's kind of stunning.
Wow.
And if you could plot complexity, it would look a lot like this. As an example, we all remember the first satellite that was a Sputnik 1 in 1957. And now there's, at any one time, there's 5,400 satellites up there. And in the coming years, according to Scientific American, there'll be another 430,000 from 16 countries. That's, I just visualize this fog of data going up there. Makes my head hurt.
Few balloons.
Yeah. Father Rick used to talk about monkey mind, and I know what he's talking about. You just get covered up with data. So about 36 million years ago, I was not here for that, there's an eruption down in the Collegiate Range down by Salida. So it deposited and welded tuff here that hardened into the rhyolite rock. So we had about a 20-foot layer over the whole area here. And then over the many years, they eroded away and just left those mesa tops with the rhyolite stone on top. So early in the 1870s, before Castle Rock was formed, there was a town up north, a settlement north of Castle Rock, about 2 miles, called New Memphis. This is primarily a gambling and drinking establishment, I understand. And then south of town, this would be kind of down south of where the Ford dealer is, there was a town called Douglas, and that had a general store, and it was a mail drop too. The train would drop off mail there. So there was a man that had property there named Madge, and he realized he had a deposit on the the mountaintop where he owned. So he developed it into a quarry for rhyolite. And initially, he just would quarry it by hand, load it on wagons, and haul it down here to the railroad siding. But then he eventually got the railroad to build a spur up to that. And then other pits took off after that, the O'Brien, and there's one out here on Wolfensberger, was the Santa Fe quarry. So that was, Castle Rock rhyolite was well known at the time. So it's used locally. You can see it around here. Our church, of course, was built out of it. And the school across the street, and a lot of buildings downtown. And then in Denver, the Molly Brown House you've been to, that's part rhyolite from here, as well as some sandstone. The Antlers Hotel in Colorado Springs was built out of it. So it's used all over, but then eventually the concrete construction took over. It was cheaper, a lot less hand labor. And the quarries closed between 1900 and 1920. They pretty much shut down. But rhyolite was kind of the foundation of Castle Rock. That was the only industry around besides farming at that time. So this just kind of shows how tough it was. It was all hand quarried into big blocks. And then when it got to the site, the stonemasons had to break it into smaller, sizable blocks to fit the wall they were building. So this picture is taken from the Santa Fe quarry or west of town. It was owned by a guy named Nelson. And my grandparents always told a story about him. He would hire these guys, and it was tough work, probably 10 hours a day for a few dollars a day. And then they realized they needed a place to stay, so his wife started a boarding house. So he'd work these guys all day, pay them. They go down the hill, pay his wife to live in the boarding house. So over the years, he saved a lot of money, enough to where he bought this big ranch over west of Sedalia after the quarries closed. Yeah, just a circular dollars. And then Castle Rock itself, up there is a conglomerate. There's rhyolite, sandstone, probably a little granite in there as well. But that was the bottom of a stream bed. It's kind of hard to imagine looking up there today, thinking that being the bottom of a stream bed. There was a landmark before the town was built. There's reference to it in the Long expedition. He mentions a Castle Rock, and that was in 1820. But most people think he was talking about a different place. And then later in the 1840s, the Fremont expedition came through, and they called this Pound Cake Rock. And then finally in 1850, there's a miner named David Kellogg, and he claims to call it Castle Rock. So the name seemed to have stuck. And you can see those cattle pens there. Right here's and those are still there when I was a kid. So occasionally you'd see a herd come in and load up on the trains, but
Is that the Scott Ranch?
pardon me?
What's the ranch? You know what that ranch is? That house?
I don't.
I
Yeah,
was thinking it looks like a Scott.
yeah. And then the star we see, that was first erected in 1936, and there was a newer one put up there in 1949. And then there was a road put up around the side there. I don't remember what year, but it's like it's now a trail, but it comes around here and it comes up to an outlook. And that was sometime in the 1950s. So you used to be able to drive up there, and then they cut that off to cars at some point. Then when I was in high school, it was a tradition when you were a senior to paint your year up on the side. So it had like 59, 60. So I graduated in 1965. So our turn came. We had to go around the backside. So we found a volunteer, and we had to pump about 5 beers in him before we get him to hang over the side. But he painted a 65 on there. So the next day we went and looked at it, but we should just give him 3 beers because it was pretty scraggly. But that was about the last year the town got pretty tired of that, so they hired a firm to come in and sandblast it, and that put an end to that, which is a good thing. I think eventually a kid would have fallen off that.
Oh, yeah.
Peggy and I actually had a cousin that fell off way back when and was killed. So And then most of you or some of you are aware that we had a pretty prominent racetrack here. It was called Continental Divide Raceways. So it was built in 1959, and it's out there if you take from Castle Rock on the west frontage road, kind of across from where Crystal Valley is. It was right on that hillside. So it was primarily a drag racing track, and it was open to everybody. I mean, if you had a car you thought was pretty fast, you could race there. They put you in a class, and it was great for me. I worked there a couple of summers. I worked in what they called the hot gate. So people who loved the race came in. They had to pay a fee. But once I collected that and turned the money in, at about noontime, I could hang around the pit area and watch all those dragsters and race cars. So it's, I don't know if you ever sit next to a dragster when it leaves, but it's impressive. And I had a exhibition of some jet dragsters there a couple of times, which was fun to watch. And then and we actually had all the top names. If you ever followed drag racing, there's a guy named Dan Gartlitz, who was a big time drag racer, but he was here often. And then they started the Rocky Mountain 150, and that was an IndyCar type race. And again, we had all the top drivers. Mario Andretti won one year, and AJ Foyt. And then we had some sports car races. I don't know if you remember the Smothers brothers from TV. Well, Dick Smothers raced out here several times. And then in 1972, Evel Knievel came to town. so I went to this. It was interesting. We went out there and they had some kind of a preliminary thing. It wasn't too eventful. And his trailer was down there, but no Evel. So we sat there, and the grandstands were on the side of a hill right in the sun. And this was like July, as I remember, so it was quite hot. And finally, this twin-engine airplane came down and buzzed the crowd, buzzed us again. They landed out on the drag strip, and Evel Knievel got out and talked to us. And I don't know if you called, he was going to do that Snake River jump in Idaho. It was going to be a mile wide jump over this canyon. So he told us how he was going to do that, and he said, I'll be out in a bit. So in his trailer, and we had sat there for at least a half hour. I don't know if he was drinking or what, to get a little, but he finally came out. So he just, so he finally came out, and he demonstrated this bike he was going to jump the Snake River on, and it was really cartoonish. It was a little jet-propelled motorcycle, and it was the Snake River is going to be a mile long. So, a little angle off at the beginning, you're not going to make it. And he couldn't control his attitude. There was no wings on it. So he went up and down with that. And I just thought it was kind of comical at the time. And then I don't know if you followed it, but what he ended up doing, he had a track with essentially a rocket on one side. And he took off. And the idea was to launch over the river and deploy a parachute and then come down on the other side. Unfortunately, when he took off, the parachute deployed at the same time. So he never even made it to the river. It was kind of like Wile E. Coyote, a little poof down at the bottom. And I read later, he said if he'd have landed in the river, he'd have drowned because his harness froze as well. So he'd have never got out of the rocket. And then some years later, another daredevil did that. Actually, he jumped the Snake River. But anyway, after hearing that, he got on his regular bike, and I think he set a world record for a wheelie. He went down the drag strip some distance and back, and then he teased us a few times. He'd make a run at the ramp and then pull off. Then finally, he did this. But this is a pretty easy jump for him. Not something I would do, but for him, pretty easy. And then shortly after that, there was an accident in the pits there. There was a man killed. And that led to a lawsuit. So in 1979, it's pretty much closed. So that was sold to a developer at that time. They actually developed or put in all the infrastructure, streets, sewer, and water. And that was when the S&L crisis hit. So he went under. But now I understand it's been platted again. And I think they have to wait till the Crystal Valley interchange is built.
Yeah.
And there'll be something like another 3,000 houses in there. So just what we need.
Build some more out.
Yeah.
Grumble, grumble, grumble.
Yeah, there's not gonna be water. Great Lake.
Well, back when the settlers first came here in the late 1850s, and they started settling at Cherry Creek and Platte River in Denver. So a lot of the Indians at that time warned them that the Platte River could flood, and some 20 years earlier, by their estimation, there was a huge flood. But anyway, Denver was started to be settled. Then in 1864, there was a major flood that came down Cherry Creek and the Platte, and it wiped out probably more than half of Denver at the time. And there was another flood in 1912, and then in 1933, you're familiar with the Castlewood Canyon Dam out here by Franktown. That broke and went down through Denver. So finally, in 1950, the Cherry Creek Dam was built to alleviate that. So in 1945, there was a study recommended that there be a dam put on the South Platte and Plum Creek, essentially Chatfield Reservoir. And then in 1950, the dam was actually authorized by Congress. But at the time, there was no local political will. It involved condemning a lot of ranches and property down there. So nobody wanted to tackle that, so it just sat there that way. Then in the spring of 1965 was a very, very odd weather pattern set up. So Monday, June 14th, there were some storms down in Colorado Springs that flooded the city and area. Then the next day, Tuesday, some real heavy rains from Greeley to Sterling, and the creeks and overflowed, and there was some road damage there. Then Wednesday was the big event here. So starting about 1:30. So at the time, I had a summer job with CDOT, what was at that time the Department of Highways. And we were building the frontage roads and new northbound lanes south of town here. So we were surveying, and it started to rain, and they sent us into the office. And then the hourly employees, like myself, about noontime, they said, just go home. So it started to rain, and it's unimaginable. We've all been in heavy thunderstorms, but usually it's like a 10 or 15 minute duration. This just went on for hours. So down north of Palmer Lake, there was 14 inches of rain in 4 hours. So that all went into East and West Plum Creek. So this is a picture of Hunt Mountain right north of Larkspur, and looking down at East Plum Creek. And there was water spouts that just sat down and just washed a gully right down the side of the hill. So you can imagine how much water was up there. And there's some similar ones over on West Plum Creek too. If you drive down to Prairie Park Road, you can see some there as well. And then it progressed. I should talk so long.
There.
Uh-oh.
There
All
you go.
right.
There you go.
So this is the I-25 bridge over East Plum Creek by Larkspur. And this was kind of a tragic sight. The State Patrol was about ready to shut down the highway. They were concerned about all the structures. So a truck came along, and he begged to be let across because he was late, wanted to get home. So they waved him on, and that's when the bridge collapsed. So he was lost and never recovered. When we went out to survey later, they told us to watch for a body or the truck, and we never saw either one. So he's still buried in the sand down there somewhere. This is an aerial of Cass Rock. So I want to tell you what the population was there. I didn't write it down. Anyway. So to orient yourself, this is Wolfensberger, and that would be the Guadalajara restaurant, McDonald's, and this is the frontage road that goes out to the high school. So you can see the damage that was done to all these structures through there.
So that's the football field. The high school.
Yeah, that's right. So there was no Walmart or houses or anything else at that time. And actually, this frontage road had just been built. It was about a year old. So this is a closer view of the bridge over Plum Creek down there in Wolfensberger. The bridge over I-25 survived. Water went under it. I actually watched a trailer house float underneath it, but the creek bridge failed. And this is another view of it there. And this is down at Sedalia. If you leave Sedalia on Highway 67 to go up Jar Canyon, the bridge survived, but all the approaches washed out next to it. So they estimate this is where the east and west Plum Creek come together, roughly. So it pushed on towards Littleton, and they estimated that the crest of the flow was 154,000 CFS. So that's a huge number, but to put it in perspective, in 1983 and 84, there were consecutive 100-year floods on the Colorado River. And that happened over there in those years because there was a big snow melt, a real slow warming in the spring. And then we got heat, so all that snow melt caused that. So anyway, so the flood at the state line on the Colorado River were 61,000 and 70,000. So they were much less than the crest we had here. The difference is ours was a short-term crest, and the Colorado River stayed like that for a number of days, so the volume of water was more. And the Cherry Creek, the reservoir there, the level rose 16 feet. So you can imagine how much damage and life would have been lost without that. Anyway, that got people more interested, so the Chatfield Dam took center stage. So it started by the Army Corps of Engineers in '67, then completed in 1975. And then also the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District was started in 1969. So there's a little more handle. So this next picture,
This film here, the Sedalia Grange Hall and the Presbyterian Church.
that's right, yep. Yeah, did y'all hear that? There was a Grange Hall right there in the creek and the Presbyterian Church. And yeah, and our cousin Tommy Heyer had to tie a rope to himself and went out and rescued a guy out of a house that was floating down the street. So he had ended up in Littleton probably. So the next picture I'll show is actually a film, and I apologize for the quality. This is old 8mm film, and it sat around and kind of decomposed over the years. Then I got it moved to a CD, and it'll start out where you can hardly see anything, and it gets a little bit better. But to orient yourself, imagine going down here to Cantrell Street, taking a right and going over to 5th Street, and take a right again and going up the hill right in front of Father Brian's house. So these pictures will be taken from the porch of Father Brian's house looking down on the flood. So this will get a little bit better as we go. So that's coming down 5th Street. And that's a real steep grade, so you can imagine the velocity of that water. So to create a cross-section area that wide, that's a lot of water. Yeah, really.
Good thing it's going that way.
Great.
I think this is down on the Plum Creek there, but unfortunately it was a little better quality. So this was the courthouse that was built between 1889 and 1890 out of the rhyolite rock that I mentioned. So it was the county courthouse, but it was also a town center. It was the closest thing we had to a park. There was all that green grass around there. And then there was a tennis court over to the side here, to the southwest side. And the fire department would usually flood that in the winter. We had an ice skating rink. So I spent a lot of time down there when I was a kid. And the sheriff's office and jail was right down here in this garden level. And then the other county offices were upstairs from that. As a matter of fact, when we were, I guess, maybe junior high age, on summer nights, you could sneak over to the window, and a couple of them looked right down in the cell. So if there was somebody down there, they knew they couldn't get to us, so we tell them they're going to spend the rest of their life in jail. You're ugly, your mother was ugly. So,
Yeah, that's not nice.
so you can imagine they had a few things to say back, so my vocabulary got really good. So then in 1978, there was a young man arrested for drunk driving, and he was placed down in the jail there. But his girlfriend decided she would break him out, and thought of a good way to do that was to set a small fire in a stairwell, and then have to let everybody out, and she could run away with them. So the small fire in the stairwell turned into that. So that old dry wood that's been varnished 100 times, it just was like there was no hope of putting it out. It just went up like a match. So fortunately, there was nobody killed in there. It's a lot of those people in the jail or the sheriff's office could have been pretty bad. So this is kind of the aftermath. So,
Look at that ladder truck for the fire department.
yeah.
Looks like a bucket truck.
It does. So that was, anyway, it was a total loss. And then it was rebuilt. A new building was put there in 1980. And if you were here at the time, there was a lot of controversy over that. The design was not well received. I think it's a nice building, but a lot of people wanted it to be built back to something that looked like the old one. But it never was. So. Anyway, I have these posters. So we can start passing them around, but it just recaps the.
I'm gonna show one people on Zoom real quick. These two go together. Oh, so these are recaps of the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, just so people on Zoom kind of know.
I forgot to mention, I'm sorry. This is since we're in church, I have a confession.
The mic.
Yeah. Can you hear me? We were talking about the courthouse fire. I forgot to mention. This is an old records book that survived the fire. And I really should have it back to the county. It's a chattel mortgages. There's no real estate involved in it. So I don't feel too guilty having it. But I'll leave it here and you can look through it when you want. It's quite interesting where people, this goes back to the 1900s. So people borrow money to buy cattle and then pay it back. But what's interesting to look at is the penmanship in here. Everything was handwritten.
Oh, you want to stay over here?
A little bar.
Go around, tell him to move. Is that it? Wow.
Your turn now.
Oh, no. So, this is a celebrity.
I have a question. Where was the drive-in? We used to come on Wednesday night for Buckner.
Right.
And you could get in for $1, but you had to have $1 at the concession stand.
Yeah.
And I saw, every Wednesday they would have the Zorro cereal.
Yeah.
And remember with Barbara Steinweg and Big Country? Who was it? Barbara Stein?
I should remember that.
Gregory Peck?
I think it was Gregory Peck, yeah.
But that was the highlight. And we lived in Black Forest during that time. And we went down in our crawl space. And we drove around and up in those mountains on the Lake. Well, you would believe it because you that water pulled down through that
Oh,
mountain.
yeah, it's
unbelievable.
really is. Yeah.
In 1946. And then she was married to my mom's brother, who was Bob Sobey, and he's the one that fell off Castle Rock.
It was a lot of tragedy. They left 2 children,
Yes.
Bob and Lorna.
Yeah, Bob and
They
Lorna.
turned out to be terrific people. But
Yeah.
they were more or less raised by
So,
their aunts and uncles.
right, they were my double cousins.
Yeah.
And then I was married to Dan Burgess for 50, almost 60 years. And he had the Ford dealership, the Burgess Motor Company down here. And he was the fire chief the year of the courthouse burn. And he was also hauled a lot of people out of the river when they had the flood because they had a record. And they said there was, they were working on the road down south, down by Larkspur. And they had all these big Euclids, I think they call them.
Yeah,
Those
they're,
big earth moving machines.
They call them scrapers.
Yeah.
They used to in the big earthwork moving machines.
And they said those were just bobbing up and down when they came down here and washed out the bridge.
I mentioned I worked for the highway department at the time, and at nighttime they'd always line those big Euclid scrapers up so the oiler could come at night and fuel them and work on them. So that day, when it started to rain, they had to stop work, so they lined them up just like you were saying. So it was about, the flood came, it was probably 2 or 3 days before our highway crew could get back out there. And those were literally buried up to their stack in sand. So they dug them out, and they had to all be reconditioned.
Yeah.
And if
I
one of
think
those
maybe
machines,
some of them washed dirt on.
they may have.
That's what took out the bridge, was that all the debris built up,
Right.
cars and everything.
But those machines today, I think, would be 700,000 or 800,000 maybe. At the time, they were a good 100,000. So that was, I think there were 6 or 7 of them. So they took a big loss, or the insurance did.
So I guess that's
I was going to mention earlier, when we showed that population map and how flat it was all those years in the county. Well, I have a lot of double cousins, so Olivia's one of my double cousins, and Natalie, related to her through my mom and my father, and a bunch of others. And I always thought that was a little different, and like trying to explain it to Sue, her eyes kind of glaze over. But when you look at the population, the dating pool wasn't that big. So, and they were all pretty happy. But I don't remember any divorces or any bad times. They all got along.
There weren't a lot of other choices, so you have to be happy. Anyone else like to?
Can I give some Little Bears, history? Little Bears preschool,
Here, Natalie.
started in 1957. Nobody will need to have a microphone. It started in 1957, so it is 66 years old and still running. It started in Beth Scott's basement or back room in 1957 because there was no kindergarten here. So she was not trained as a teacher, and she saw a need and filled it. Then my mother, Mildred Stewart, and she worked with her for 3 years, then brought it up here to Christ Church. And she had it for, I think, 16 more years. And then Mrs. June was an interim. She was only here for a year. And then I took it over in 1987, and it's the only thing I'll beat my mother at. I had it 25 years. And now Shelley Kirk runs Little Bears Preschool, and it's still running. When we started, it was the only preschool not in town, in the county. Well, Highlands Ranch was still a working ranch. There wasn't all this, and it was the only one until the Lutheran preschool up on the hill came into business. It could not have survived without Christ Church because it was a partnership. It was a ministry. It was truly, truly a ministry. I had so many little kids whose parents couldn't pay. So it was not a money-making deal. But I thought, when they came to me and said, we have to take the kid out, only 3 months left of school, we have to take the kid out. I said, no, that whether the kid's here or at home, It's not gonna make any difference to my pocketbook, but it will to the kid. And so, I might get clamped. This church in Little Bears Preschool has served a lot of children. And I'm here to tell you it saved some. So, but the most momentous thing, I grew up here in this church too. Our ancestors from Wales and Scotland, you might have caught something happening there this morning. And so this was our church. This is, of course, the Anglican church was where we went. So lots of momentous stuff. I grew up in this church with my husband's sister from the time we were little tiny kids. And we wanted to be acolytes so much. We really wanted to be acolytes, but it was the late 50s and the early 60s, so guess what? Here's the altar guild cabinet. I'm really glad for that too, though, because I know about what's going on at the altar, but we really wanted to be acolytes. So thank you, Christ Church.
I want to throw in one tiny comment. I know men gossip because all of you, Danny Burgess and your father and all of them sat in the B&B Cafe when I was working there. And they had those round tables and by heaven, they gossiped.
Think of all the problems they solved.
Every single morning. Every single morning. They all, John Bull, everybody did that.
Other comments, other questions? Yeah, Sean.
Compared to the rest of you, I am a newcomer. I've only lived here 15 years, but I just wanted to share for some of you who may not be aware that the school across the street was going to go up for sale, and it was zoned to be multifamily housing. And the town of Castle Rock stepped in and purchased the school, and so it will be a community center soon.
I'm glad you said that. I had heard something about it. And that's
The sale should be completed within the next month or so, and then it'll gradually be renovated, but the history will all be maintained.
Very good. Like a community art center, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to, Ed didn't say anything about this little bitty girl that was hidden by the mother back when the Indians came. Because you hear about this stuff now, like this shootings and everything. And the reason we have guns now is because the Indians were just slaughtering everybody because they didn't have 6-shooters back then. Once we got 6-shooters, everybody started getting guns. But anyway, what I was going to say about this little girl, I guess her mother said, you go up or down or wherever, and don't come up till I get you. And how long was that? Several hours?
Yeah, it was my grandma Ball, great grandmother, lived over here. So when her mother saw the Indians coming, like I said, you didn't know in those days. It was past the major Indian wars, but there was still a lot of unrest. So she told her to get in this little attic space and don't make a sound, because occasionally Indians would kidnap young girls.
And she was blonde.
Yeah. So it was, all the men were out working, and her mother had been cooking corn and bread for the noontime meal. So when the Indians arrived, they said they were very hungry, wanted to be fed. So she brought all the corn and bread out, and the Indians ate all they could. And what they didn't eat, they put in her blanket, got on a horse, and left. So she was in the closet there for probably 2 or 3 hours.
That's a long time ago.
But again, they
Was
didn't.
she 4 or 5 years old?
She was about 11.
Oh,
yeah.
And also that Caroline Ball is, there's a stained glass window.
Yeah.
In case
Yeah, it's in memory.
been in there lately.
And if you see her stained glass window there, that's about where the entrance was to the old original church. We shows in those pictures.
I would just like to mention all the priests that we've had here. When we first came, it was Father Don White, who was a real saint. Well, for instance, he and his wife had saved up the money to take the 3 children and go on vacation when an indigent person came by, and he gave that man all the money for the vacation. But the next day, a donation came in to cover that, so the Lord was watching.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
then we had Father Ed Rufy, who was a good man, but this parish just wasn't right for him. I still keep in touch with them, and he's retired now, and they're the goingest people. Anything that's going on in Portland, they're there. And then, of course, we had Father Rick, but I guess most of you know Father Rick. But he and my husband, Conrad, got the new church built. That was their big thing, and they got it done. So there's room for all of us now.
Yeah.
See you all on Sunday.
Yeah, my first memory was Father Russell, or they call him Reverend Russell. I don't know whether he's.
I thought that was his first name.
I did too. So he baptized me according to my records. But I remember being scared of him. He was always dressed in black with a black hat and not real warm, as I recall. I was very little at the time. But then after that, or shortly after, they started sending we were a mission at that time. We didn't become a full congregation until later. But they sent out a Father Thayer from Denver, and he was totally opposite. He was very lively, energetic, funny. I realized he could laugh in church, when he came. I used to be afraid to laugh. And then he had a young priest that came with him for a while named Father Pitkin. So Natalie and Mike would remember Father Pitkin. He really started, we became a full congregation at that point. What's the right word?
A parish.
A parish. We became a full parish then, and Father Pitkin became our first parish priest. And he was very interested in the youth. He started the youth group here, and Mike and Natalie remember we used to have dances here in this hall. And even friends I have today that weren't Episcopalians, they still remember coming to those dances. Because there wasn't much else to do here at that time.
No, he was a terrific liturgist. He was a terrific teacher. And he was careful about what he said. I mean, he didn't say things that weren't real. I mean, he was a learned man, and he also played the organ. Who's that? Father Pitkin. Oh, he'd go running down that aisle and cata and cassock just flying to get back up to the pulpit. And the bishop at that time was Bishop Joseph Minnis, who, and Thayer was his suffragan bishop for a while.
Yes, Father Thayer went on to be a bishop.
Yes, I was confirmed by Bishop Minnis. He was a great old, big, imposing guy, I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
Big old, imposing guy. And it was July 14th, 1963, and I was 9. They didn't let people get confirmed when they were there. But like that acolyte thing? We got her done.
Well, I'm going to say something now. I wanted to tell you, I don't know if you all knew this, but the task force started in here. There was a table over there, and we had all the churches were involved, and we give out vouchers, and they could go to get their car fixed or get the, we checked it out with the police to make sure, because a lot of times you have people come in and, they have records or something, and so that's still going on. I mean, it's still down there. And after it was gone from here, a lady by the name of Mila Rudolph, she lived down here in the corner, down farther. Well, where she lived?
101 Cantrell.
101. She lived there.
Not at the same time.
And so she put it in her garage. And then somehow, I don't know how the building ever got, or the staff force ever took off after that, but it's a great thing for this town. It's really been good.
2 or 3 counties.
Yeah, Douglas Elbert for sure. Yeah, is it expanded?
No, that's just Douglas and Elbert right now.
Yeah. Something that I'm realizing as we're hearing from people, it might be interesting for the folks that are here, who's been here how long. So Ed, I think between you and Peggy, we get a little arm wrestling going on here, but when were you baptized, or when did you become a member?
I was born in fall of 1946, and then they baptized me like January or February of 47.
47. And Peggy, when did you get baptized?
I got baptized in 48.
48. And you came to Christ Church around that time?
I was 9.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Hey, I was baptized in 1925.
Right, I was just getting to Maureen. So when did you and Conrad come to Christ Church?
December 1972.
72, okay. And you folks, Michael, when were you here?
I started as an acolyte here in 1951.
51.
51, 52.
Okay.
And was then confirmed and then baptized at that time. Prior to that my family didn't know about or go to church.
Yeah.
Yes. It wasn't until we moved from Highlands Ranch down here off of South Town on Tony Road that we started. And I had to become an acolyte after the first time I came with my Aunt Tiny and saw the other boys in fancy garments.
Yeah, I have to do it.
He wanted to be an acolyte too.
And Natalie, when did you get baptized? Was it
I
here?
got baptized in 1952, not long after I think on the 25th of May, which is my son's birthday.
Interesting.
But I wasn't baptized here. I was baptized at St. Philip's.
Yeah.
My mother was baptized there, my grandfather was baptized there, and my son was baptized here. But I grew up here.
In this
I
church.
grew up here in this church.
And I know Pete, you've been here for quite a while. When did you guys come?
I was a cradle Episcopal.
Yeah.
My parents were Greek Orthodox, and it passed along. So as far as formal baptism, I don't know if I ever received it, but I still see it.
So when did you guys come to Castle Rock and?
Pardon me?
When did you come to Castle Rock and Christ Church?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
When did you come to Baptist Church?
Oh,
71.
I've been
71,
received
okay.
4 times.
How about 5?
How about 9?
Get baptized by fire.
How about 9?
Just put that together.
1972.
72, okay. So we've got some long-lived members here.
We went to this church from 70 to 95.
Yeah.
But prior to that, I was raised in St. Philip's as a baby practically.
Yeah.
And that's where we went, I went and
It's
he
excellent.
talked about Reverend Russell. He probably baptized me. He also married me, but down at the church.
Well, the real advantage of hearing these stories is for the folks that have just come or come in the last decade or two, because, to drive into the Castle Rock of today, it's hard to imagine this little rural community that Ed and Peggy and other people are talking about. But it is our roots, and it is giving us the wings too to grow. Because if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't be here, I don't think. So are there any other questions, comments? We got history buffs here to answer questions. Other comments?
I just wanted to make one more. I had sent just the other day, I don't know if you picked it up or not, about the town of Castle
Peggy,
Rock.
might use the mic just so people can hear you.
Fastest growing, the county of Castle Rock is the fastest growing city in the state of Colorado. So I don't know where we're headed. It's kind of scary.
Hopefully we have the water. Hopefully we have the water.
Well, one thing I did hear, I don't know if it's true or not, but you mentioned that development there where the old CDR racetrack is. I have heard that Castle Rock's not going to annex south of that. Right. So I don't know if that's true, but that would kind of put a cap on it.
Right, and if they're gonna build a Costco, that really puts a
Yeah.
cap on it, right?
Mike, wasn't your mom was raised on the Phipps Ranch, wasn't she, on there?
I started my life there.
Yeah. So you're all familiar with the Phipps Ranch down there? So,
Highlands Range.
yeah.
And Plum Creek School. I'm an alumni of the Plum Creek School, which is now underneath,
The Chatfield.
Right.
You know, Chappie was a huge layman in the Diocese of Colorado for a long, long time. And she started the Episcopal food shelf and manned it for years and years. Pam and I got to go to the Bishop's Convention at the Broadmoor for our birthdays. 2 years when I was in 5th and 6th grade. It wasn't much of a convention. There wasn't a lot of legislation going on, I'm here to tell you. But it was fun.
Well, thanks for all your perspectives,
Yeah.
all your input. Ed, anything else you'd like to say?
I can't think of anything, but thank you. It was a good opportunity.
So good to see so many of you come. Know that it's being recorded for Zoom, so if you want to share it with someone, we'll be able to do that. Thanks so much. Feel free to stay and visit. And thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you.